Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I am joined by Georgia Channon. Now, Georgia, I believe this is your first book. It's called The Curse of Silvan Oaks, aimed at children. But Georgia will have a lot to tell us about her journey to being an author. But first of all, welcome to Mythmakers.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm very excited.
So, Georgia, I noticed from the little sort of press release I got given with your book that there's a mention of influences like C.S. Lewis and other authors like that in your background. Do you want to tell us why you've decided to do this dotty thing of being an author, and who were the authors that cheered you on your way?
Well, right from the start, I literally adored reading fantasy novels. Even the Enid Blyton, the Magic Faraway Tree, the world's turning on the tree at the top of the tree used to I found so exciting. And I love that feeling that you get, the sort of pinpricks of excitement as you go through the portal or whichever gateway it is. And then I moved on to Lion and Witch, the Magician's Nephew. I love those two, and obviously The Horse and His Boy. And I also, Joan Aitken was a great love of mine. I love those books. You know, Wolves of Willoughby Chase is less sort of fantasy, but they are living in a fantasy world because it doesn't exist. It's sort of James III made up historical time, and I love Midnight is a Place is one of my favorite books. But and then I then also loved E.M. Nesbit and their different fantasy worlds, and the reality that she brought to it. Although it was very fantastical, there was also down to earth children and comments that sort of are humorous, and I loved all that. And then the sort of idea for this book all really started when I went to A Midsummer Night's Dream as a child, taken by my school, and I became really beguiled by Oberon and Titania, and their scenes in the wood I found the most exciting part of the play, and mainly the fact that they were having this huge sort of elemental argument between each other about this little Indian boy, and their arguments were so violent that it was creating storms and earthquakes. The world was being ruptured. And so it was obviously incredibly important to both of them that they would let all this happen. And I became very interested in who this little boy was. Why was he causing this massive argument? And at the end of the play, I remember feeling slightly disappointed, sort of, because we're told in passing that Titania, she just hands over the boy to Oberon and he walks off with him. And I just didn't believe it. Titania was so feisty and strong and proud. I just knew she wouldn't give up this boy because she tells how much she loves him. And so this idea of who the boy was and why he was so important scratched away at the back of my head for a long while, many years. And then one day I just sat down and just wrote his story and the story of Sacramond, which is the world where Titania and Oberon had their kingdoms, and where, that this little boy had obviously been hidden from Oberon. And in my book, the idea came to me that Titania hid him in the Elizabethan world, in the human world. And so Oberon couldn't find him. And that's when the story started to expand. And then Sacramond, the fantasy world, it just grew of its own accord. And I sort of started writing and it just sort of came flowing out.
So if this idea was planted when you were back in the day, when you were at school, it's obviously been a long time in the gestation. So is there much more to Sacramond that that isn't in this book?
Yes, there's a lot more to Sacramond. There's a lot of themes that get started in book one that are in book two. And in book two is almost only in Sacramond, and it takes on a whole life of itself. And to me, Sacramond is as important as the characters in this book. I love it so much, and it's sort of its own living, breathing world and character itself. And yes, so it took a long time for it to develop, but now it's got a life of its own and it's expanding.
So this is one of the things I think that might be interesting to people listening who perhaps are developing their own other world or alternative parallel world or whatever it is, or sci-fi world, is how do you make those decisions as a writer to keep out the extra information, m- the things that you've developed which aren't relevant to your story? How do you pick a line through your material?
Well, I mean, actually, initially, a lot or quite a lot of them were in the book. And then I edited it because it was at least double, almost triple the size. And it was too long and overblown. So I took those pieces out rather reluctantly. But they were always there in my head anyway. And then the very important themes for book one were obvious then. I knew which ones were the ones to stick to. But with the knowledge of the other bits of information about Sacrament, which have also gone into book two. So I sort of felt that they weren't lost. But so I had this whole biography of it all on, in my head and written down. So I knew I could draw from that.
And was that a choice that you were making, or was that with an editor's help that you
So
saw your way?
it was a combination. But when I sent it out, I got good feedback, but a lot of people said it's too long and they go on a lot of journeys, a bit like in The Hobbit, when they're always marching on another mountain path. I suddenly realized they were constantly traveling. So I cut some traveling scenes out. And then it became quite clear to me that the more you took away in some ways, the stronger the actual story that was left became.
So how long is it? Just because I think people are sometimes mystified by the business. So I think there is at the moment, the industry is looking for slightly shorter books than
Yeah.
they were previously. So just so people know what they should be aiming for, how long is your book?
It's about 70,000 words approximately.
It's still quite long.
Yeah,
So
65
you,
to 70. But I sort of,
yeah,
it was 90,000 words.
yeah.
And then I cut and cut, and then I put a little bit more in. But yeah, I think sometimes these long books can overface. I think they're brilliant in some cases, but I think if you want to if you want to get published, don't make your first book too long, because it's sort of more accessible if they're shorter. And in this case, I felt it was a much better book for it.
And were you writing this on your own, or um, how did it come that you actually found the time to do this? Was it running alongside your working life, or how did
Yeah,
it work?
I had a shop that I ran, and I was doing that with a friend. But I started writing this, and then I just did it all different times. But this was 8 years ago. I started it. I sent it to a competition, and it got turned down. And then I started sending it out to agents, and I did get an agent for a little bit, a really lovely agent called Christopher Little, and he said he loved it, and he loved the imagination, but it had a problem. It really needed editing. And I went away and started editing it to what I thought was the right standard, but I was completely untrained and I didn't really know what they were looking for. And I didn't sort of edit up to standard. And so then we parted ways. And then my cousin who lives up in the north of Scotland and wrote many books when she was younger, she started to sort of help me look at it and see ways we could sort of cut it a bit. So I did it with a sort of my cousin, really, and it was a wonderful sort of co-production, because it was so happy, and every time I got another rejection she would pick me up, and so it was a really happy process.
Yeah, and I think the willingness to be edited is such a key skill for writers. People aren't you're not geniuses who immediately produce an amazing thing first time. We all have this process because
You can't see it.
we can't see it.
And sometimes you've read this book over 100 times, so you can't even really, you can't see the wood for the trees. And yes, exactly. The editing thing, I actually enjoyed the editing. And by the end, my poor cousin was saying, you can't cut Eric the ferret, who was this sort of big character in it. And I went, Eric, he's gone. We've got to get him out. We need to get this book more slimlined and streamlined. And I actually found it quite cathartic, this process. But also I knew I was going to keep all the bits that I'd cut so that I could reuse them, which made it bearable. Otherwise, it would have been a bit of a sad process.
Yeah, and I think this idea of reusing, I don't know what you feel about this, but when I do cut things and put them in a sort of graveyard document or whatever you call your, your that bit of your
Dead babies or something. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I often find that when I go back to them, I need to rewrite them anyway
Yeah.
because I've moved on. So take the example of Eric the Ferret. If I was then going to include him, he wouldn't be how he would have been in book one. It would be a new version of him, and you rediscover those pieces that you have rejected.
It's so true. And actually, I'm glad to say Eric the Ferret does come into book
Right.
two. He is slightly different. He's left. Yeah, it's very true that.
So, as you mentioned, it's a portal fancy, it's an adventure story. So, would you just like to give us like the kind of blurb type approach so people got more of an idea of who is involved in your story?
Yes. So, I mean, in my book, there's this world Sacrament, this sort of dangerous, beautiful world that was the world of Titania and Oberon, who the king and queen of the forest from Midsummer Night's Dream. And Sacrament is connected to our world, the human world, by a series of portals. And in the olden days, so like 600 years ago and more, everyone traveled backwards and forwards through these portals before we went into the scientific age. And so it was there, I mean, in my story, but not in this actual book, but that's how Shakespeare traveled through a portal, and that's how he met Titania, and then went home to Stratford and went on to write A Midsummer Night's Dream. And so that's the premise. And so the little Indian boy that I mentioned earlier, who is being pursued by Oberon, who Titania is hiding, in her desperation, she finally hides him in the Elizabethan world in a house called Foxley Hall that's owned by someone called Lord Rivers. And then in the modern day, the descendant of the little boy, who obviously grew up in Elizabethan England and then had children and grandchildren, his descendant moves back to the area. She moves into a damp cottage near Swindon because her mother is now working in Foxley Hall. And Ollie Gill, she's the descendant, she wanders through the house and strange things start to happen to her. And eventually she is plunged back into the world of Sacrament, where Oberon and Titania's descendants, great great grandchildren, are in the midst of a sort of bloody, bitter war, which only she can really resolve.
I was transported back to my own sort of childhood tastes and reading as I was reading your book. In fact, it reminded me that one of the very first stories I wrote when I was about 10, which I've still got somewhere, was called The Tapestry Room, which took place in an old manor house like this. And the portal there was a big tapestry which kept changing and being sewn into different shapes. I should write it as an adult, shouldn't I? Anyway, it was a wonderful sort of concept which I had got from the same sort of reading matter that you were talking about. I also was thinking of The Children of Green Know as I was reading it, another wonderful classic novel. So every time somebody approaches the portal fantasy, they want to do something new with it. What are you saying about your portals? Where are you going that's a little bit different? I already can see some differences with the connection to the sort of pre-scientific age, for
Yeah.
example. Tell us a little bit about the doorway that you have chosen.
Well, there's more than one doorway because obviously that people had portals going backwards and forwards, and there's one hidden in a maze in my book that leads into the old Oakwood near Foxley Hall. But there's many different portals because they are the gateways to other worlds, and there's one in a standing stone because I've always felt that standing stones, they're such mysterious, wonderful things, and in my head, I just believe they're gateways because why would they have, I know there were other reasons why they were moved across and put in these extraordinary sort of placements, but at the same time I think they contain portals, so that's also a great theme that comes through all the books that I'm going to write as well. But and yes, the portals are sort of the passageways that are two-way street, so that people from Sacrament would travel to the human world and vice versa. So I don't know that they're particularly different to other portals, but that those are the ones I've got with Sacrament and the mortal world, but to no other worlds at the moment until I write another series of books.
Yeah. I, I think what was interesting as well to read it is you took the choice of starting in Sacramento
Yeah,
and then going to Swindon. Now, for those of you who are listening from outside the UK, Swindon is it's a kind of medium-sized town, not known for being particularly architecturally exciting. It's quite close to Bath, which everyone goes, oh, Jane Austen and beautiful buildings. Swindon is the opposite, the ugly
correct.
sister of Bath. Not ugly, plain sister. Um, so as a reader, you're sort of smiling at the choice of Swindon. Nothing against Swindon, I live quite near it, but it is not the sort of sexiest location in the country. Um, but you start with the fantasy world to make the point that for the fantasy world, the child from our world is the magical person.
Exactly. And I love the contrast. I mean, it always went in my head. Do you remember um, with the Wizard of Oz when it's in black and white at the beginning,
Mm.
and when they arrive in Oz, suddenly you get the Technicolor. Well, for me, Sacrament was the Technicolor, and Swindon in the drizzling rain was the black and white. And I just wanted to start with the exciting, very vivid world of Sacrament, and then the contrast is even stronger when you the second chapter, you've got rainy Swindon, everything's a bit grey, a bit depressing, and Ollie's a bit sort of, lonely and a bit sad. And I just like the contrast of that with the sort of multicolored vision of Sacrament.
So tell us a little bit about Ollie. I noticed from your dedication that you've got Ollies in your life.
Yes.
Was that knowing?
Yes, it was. Well, actually, Olivia was my sister who died when I was young. So, and she was an avid reader, and we used to almost compete on reading. Who could read first, which books, and so that it was definitely named after her and dedicated to her. And yes, sorry, what did you ask me after that?
Well, I was asking about the actual character of
Of
Ollie
Ollie, yeah,
and
exactly.
her journey.
Well, so she's quite lonely because she'd been made to move from her school in Swindon, where she lived in the town, in the city, to this damp cottage because her father's died. And so she's very sad about that. And the mum has financial problems and has had to move from their flat and get this job at Foxley Hall. And so she's really quite sort of angry with life, finds her mum quite annoying and misses her dad and has no friends nearby. So it's all looking pretty grim. And she hasn't even started the new school, which she's slightly dreading because she doesn't find it that easy to meet new people. And so she's in a bit of a slump. And they've sort of got packing cases all over the cottage floor that got to keep unpacking. And she sort of misses the lights of the city and not having dodgy Wi-Fi and all that stuff. So she's sort of forced to go over to Foxley Hall by her mum because she's sitting at home on her phone. And that's when suddenly she explodes into this extraordinary world.
So the other hero is Corey, who is the main sort of child in the um, magical world, Sacrament world. But he's not, I wouldn't say classic hero material. His brother is more classic hero material. Do you want to talk about the two brothers?
Yes, exactly. Well, so the older brother Zandor is the typical Silvan Heart prince, very good at fighting, very brave, and sort of naturally sort of good looking. He's not horrible or anything, but he's just perfect in a way. Whereas Corey is quite clumsy and nervous, not good at fighting. Quite, he likes his studies, but he's just a bit of a nervy, can be a little bit petulant child, but he's quite young. He's learning, and he's a bit resentful that his brother's got all the sort of classic, sort of wonderful traits of a normal fighting Silvan Heart prince. But he then learns, he grows throughout the book, and at the end is very brave, which in a way he's braver than anyone because he's had to sort of dig much deeper. And also what is within him is the deep magic, which is very rare in Sacrament now. It's almost dying out, and no one knows if he has it, but people think it. But he doesn't even know he has it himself. but that's where he is special in that way as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your magic system, because magic is like a book's currency. So you could be in Harry Potter, where it seems to flow freely all the time without running out, as long as you know the spells. Whereas in, say, Lord of the Rings, it's kind of infused in the landscape and very rarely used in a sort of spell way. How would you describe your magic currency?
Well, in Sacrament, there's sort of two types of magic. There's the deep magic, which is incredibly and all powerful, and in the wrong hands is devastating. And then there's the green magic, which is lighter, more. They would still use it today in Sacrament for just everyday things. It, cure a cold maybe, or just a silly practical joke type magic. But the deep magic has been lost. It was banned many years before Oberon and Titania because it was so destructive. Almost you could say like nuclear. And so it was sort of banned, and then all the old and ancient magic sort of died away because people were persecuted, and so now, but it doesn't have to always be bad, the deep magic. It's just got to be in the right hands. And so now it's sort of like an ancient myth almost. People don't, like Xandor doesn't really believe in all the old magic and all that stuff. And he's a bit scathing of his great uncle, who's a bit of a magic druid type. And he's scathing because he just thinks it's all rubbish and he just wants to, save his kingdom, which is sort of basically being defeated by Oberon's troops. But so the magic is dying away in a way, and the trees are cursed. The oak trees that are they're the great allies of the Silvan Hearts. And that's another feature in my book, is that the landscape is as important as the characters, in my view. The trees and the mountains and the animals are all as important as the human sort of people. So, and there's magic everywhere in that respect, but it's not sort of obvious doing a spell magic.
I was always been very taken by the sort of agreement between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis that books can be applicable rather than allegorical. The difference being the allegory rests in the power of the author and the applicability rests in the power of the reader. You can apply it to whatever you like. What are you expecting your readers to sort of take away from this? What kind of applications? Because I could see several messages is the wrong word, because it's not like a po-faced message novel, but there were some applications that I could think of.
Well, I mean, I think Corrie, for instance, as an example, is he's obviously not the hero, but he's got the deep magic, and he can talk to the moon mermaids, and the trees are his allies. So, in a way, you could say that sort of, it's taking away the fact that you don't have to be all shiny and brave to be a hero, And Ollie is the same. She's down at mouth, not particularly popular, sad, because of her father and feeling lonely and isolated. And in fact, she's the biggest hero in Sacrament with, it's not what you think. What you think is the obvious shiny magic ingredients is actually, it's sometimes much more simple than that. And it's what's inside you and what you achieve rather than the outside aura.
Yeah, and also just reading the description of you. I don't know if this is made up by your publisher or something you offered, but it makes you out to be quite a dreamer.
I am, and it's funny enough, I've just spent the day yesterday with my oldest friend, who I've known since she was in her mother's womb. She came to my christening while her mom was
pregnant. That old.
Yeah. And she just said, you always had it in you, because they had a gate at the end of their garden, and apparently I always used to make her sit on the gate, and we'd pretend when the gate swung open we were in another land, and I'd completely forgotten this. But yes, it's totally true. Every time I used to walk through a wood, or see the mists rising across a field, or hear an owl hoot, on a moonlit night, I always get the shivers and think, this is the time that you would be brought through a portal or into another dimension or century. And, sometimes I'd look around and sort of think, is this going to happen to me? I'd love it. It's so exciting. And I always will, I'll never forget I don't know if you know the book Ghosts, as in The Amazing Mr. Blunden, but at one point these three children come through. You see these figures coming through the mists, and that's their portal, and they're from 2 centuries before, and they walk through into the garden, and it's one of the most sort of haunting, exciting experiences. So I'd always look at mists thinking, if I walk through that, will I walk out into another world or another land or another century?
So the question I have for you then is, if you're a sort of dreamer by nature, does this mean that when you sit down to write, you are equally unstructured in the way you approach it, or are you actually secretly ruthlessly organized?
I'm certainly not organized, but I can be quite organized in my head with how I think something should happen, chapter wise. But I mean, I've written this book in car parks waiting for children. I've written it sort of in bed. I've written it sort of on a train. I feel quite lucky. The minute I get my head down, I can immediately do it, and I kind of know when a chapter should end. It just, I don't know, it's a sort of natural thing. I feel the rhythm of it. It'd be good to finish it here. I'm not organized enough. I've got piles of paper, and it's like, where did I put that list about Corrie's sort of character traits, and where did I put this? But it is sort of all there in my head in various different sort of dusty bookcases, but it is there, but it's not that organized.
Well, I think quite a few people will find that reassuring. I've found as I've gone on that I have a sort of hybrid version of this, a bit of dreaming and a bit of organizing. And I think the more you do it, the more you have a story instinct, which means you don't have to plan as much, in that you're in a sort of, it's a bit like when you know how to drive, you don't have to think about mechanics of driving anymore. It's a bit similar when you've got a story instinct. So you've already mentioned there's going to be a part 2. Do you have a title for part 2 yet?
I do have a title. I mean, it may change, but at the moment it's called The Death of the Deep Magic.
So we got an idea of the theme there.
Yes.
And do you see this as a long series, or has it already got
it was a trilogy, but it's possible it's got to be a bit longer than that, because I can't quite see myself resolving all the plot lines and stories in book 3, because there's some huge ones to come, which I think, and book 2 sort of burst out and has got so many. I've left myself at the end on such a cliffhanger that's going to be quite difficult. I've got to think, how on earth am I going to write book 3? And I've got a feeling it won't quite resolve everything, but that makes me very happy, because I'm always happy when I'm in Sacrament and writing new stuff.
Yes, I'm my first fantasy series was a quartet. So I'm fond of I'm fond of the quartet.
Me too, actually.
So that's fascinating, Georgia. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And The Curse of the Silvan Oaks is probably, I'd say, aimed at a middle grade reader.
Yes, it's seen as 9 to 12, but I think older. I mean, a lot of adults have read it and have enjoyed it, so I think it's from 9 till 99, to be honest. But
yes, and in the American market, they tend to put what we call middle grade a little bit older anyway, so it might be the young end of YA over there, but perfect for the dreaming child.
Perfect for the dreaming child, exactly.
Yeah. So we always have a little bit of fun at the end of our interviews, where we let go of where we've been talking about and just take a theme from that book into all the fantasy worlds available to us. And I was thinking, what would I like to take from your book? And the thing that struck me is, I love this idea of the normal girl from Swindon who pitches up in the fantasy world to find that she's the hero, and go quite unprepared for it. So I wondered where in all the fantasy worlds you would like to discover that you're the hero, imagining you've stumbled into it by some mischance.
Well, it's possibly a bit of a cliche, but I think I would have to say I'd like to take the second star to the right and straight on till morning and end up in Neverland, just because of the beauty of the landscape and the wildness, and the mermaids and the lost boys, and obviously then you have the pirates, and I do love a bit of a pirate ship and what results from that. So I think Neverland I would like to end up in, maybe just by the mermaids, by the water.
A very fine answer, but I would advise you not to get stuck in Wendy's role.
Yes, exactly.
It seems to involve a lot of sewing and
being
mother.
looking after health. No, very good point.
Yeah. I was actually tickled to remember a previous interviewee who we had maybe a couple of years ago, a lady called Michelle Diner, who writes adult fiction, and I'm particularly fond of her class 5 science fiction stories. They've got a love story in, but the conceit in those books I really enjoy is people have been abducted from Earth to be taken into this scenario of warring planets, but the planet don't sing particularly well in this world, but they love music. So when this lady, I think she's something ordinary, like, I know, a librarian or something, or a school teacher, she turns up and she starts humming along and sings happy birthday to somebody, and like the world screeches to a halt. Oh wow, you're amazing.
That's
And she's saying,
brilliant.
but I'm just ordinary. You should really hear people who can sing, you know.
I
You
love
should
that.
hear Adele and Frank Sinatra. And so there's a series of these characters turning up in the books in this series until the third one, where they've abducted a music teacher, and wow. And so there's a brilliant scene where they're trying to get protection for her. She's amongst the enemies, and the allies are trying to say, well, she's really important. Sing, sing. And she's thinking, why do I got to sing? You know, she's only just arrived. So she's really angry. So she starts singing Bohemian Rhapsody, including all the operatic bits. And that makes me absolutely hoot with laughter. Just that. So as I sing okay-ish, I would like to find myself in that world where I would be regarded as, like, you know, diva, could command any price for my concert. So that's the class 5 series.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. So would encourage people out there to have fun imagining where you might end up as a hero if you don't feel very heroic in your ordinary life. There is a place for you in fantasy.
True.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Georgia. And your book publishes in April. Do you have a date for that?
Yeah, April the 10th.
April the 10th. That's, if you're listening to this later, that was April the 10th, 2025. So thank you very much for being with us. It's been a wonderful chat with you about The Curse of the Silvan Oaks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.